Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for taking some time today to sit down with me and help provide a little insight into how NOCSAE operates, particularly with regard to the organizations that are represented here today. And I want to briefly introduce the two people that we're having a discussion with today. First is Dr. Jessica Higgs. She is one of the two board representatives representing, or board of directors representing the American College Health Association. I don't remember the exact year you started, Dr. Higgs, but I want to say it's about 2019. Is that right?
3 or 4 years, yeah.
Okay, yeah. It wasn't too long before everything just came to a screeching halt in society. I remember that very well.
Yes.
And then the other person is Dr. Jeff Mjaanes, who's been with us since 2012, representing the American Academy of Pediatrics. Both serve, to refresh everybody's memory about the organization at NOCSAE, both serve at the request of their representative organizations. So NOCSAE operates through a board of directors that is identified by organizations. American Academy of Pediatrics is one of those. American College Health Association is one of those, and multiple other organizations. Those groups choose from their own membership the people that they think are best suited or maybe perhaps willing to come and serve as a director, a voting director on the NOCSAE board of directors. And so the organization itself, NOCSAE, doesn't have any power to pick and choose who gets sent, and that's by design. We want the organizations to make that decision. So we have live bodies sitting in the directors' chairs at every meeting, but those people have been hand selected by their representative organizations. And it's always been fascinating to me to see the interaction between what NOCSAE does, both as a standards development organization, as well as an organization that funds a substantial amount of original collegiate level research into the areas of sports injury, sports medicine, protective sciences, etc. Because everybody brings to the table something different. And somebody far smarter than me was the person that came up with the idea that we should be an organization that has organizations on the board instead of hand-picked people, because that way we prevent an overloading of interests and make sure that all sides of issues are fully explored. There's a different history between the organizations and NOCSAE, and I'll start with Dr. Higgs, who's one of the newest members. But a newest member from an organization that's been on the NOCSAE board, I guess, for lack of a better word, since the very beginning. When the NCAA and the National High School Federation met in the very, very late 1960s and early 70s, they selected a group of people to come together to create this national committee to address what at that time was a very serious wave of fatalities in organized football arising from head injuries. And so they picked and chose people who were leaders in their areas. And during that meeting, one of the original forming directors, for lack of a better word again, was a Dr. Combs, who represented the American College Health Association and also Purdue University. So that was 1971. And I know Dr. Holmes served for a while. Shortly after he left, Dr. Don Cooper became a board member. Dr. Cooper was president of the American College Health Association in 1968. So the relationship between ACHA and NOCSAE goes back a long ways. Our current president is the other member representing the American College Health Association on the NOCSAE board. So they go back a long ways, and it's that kind of continuity is extremely important for the organization. Dr. Mjaanes, on the other hand, didn't show up on our doorstep until 2012 when the existing board approved the addition of a chair through the American Academy of Pediatrics. And Dr. Mjaanes attended, I think, his first meeting in 2012. So we go from an organization that's been there from the beginning to one that is, as far as history goes, fairly recent history. But the different interests also show that NOCSAE is able to take advantage of the unique perspective that each of the organizations provides. And what I'm going to do to start this conversation off, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to ask Dr. Higgs first and then Dr. Mjaanes, but I'd like to just a brief overview of your roles and experiences and how you see your relationship and what you contribute on the board as it relates to your associations.
Okay. So as you mentioned, ACHA has been involved in this board for a while now, and ACHA stands for American College Health Association. It's an association of clinicians, nurses, counselors, health promotion staff, all those that take care of college students as a whole, but many of our clinicians and other providers also work with the athletic teams at our colleges at the D1 through D3, NAIA, all the other sports representations, as well as our weekend warriors of students that are not maybe on the official teams, but playing on side teams or just out doing their own thing. So we provide I think an outlook for NOCSAE is a very focused age group. Obviously, most of our students traditionally are in that late teens, early 20s age, and are very highly active and are competing at all levels, whether that's recreationally on the weekend or competing at the highest stage on TV, in bowl games or things like that. So what we are seeing from our student athletes and what kind of injuries we're seeing and how it's taking a toll on them is the kind of perspective that we can provide to NOCSAE at the meetings.
Thank you, Dr. Higgs. I should also mention that Dr. Higgs, as you can maybe tell from her red shirt, is affiliated with Bradley University. She is, in fact, the Director of Health Services and Family Medicine, Sports Medicine at Bradley University, and is a director of a team of combined 15 physicians and other healthcare providers that provide this direct care for the athletes at Bradley University. Dr. Mjaanes, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind doing the same thing. As you can tell, Dr. Mjaanes was not hesitant to bring the purple colors to the meeting. And Dr. Mjaanes currently serves as a director of intercollegiate and health services, sports medicine, and he's also the head team physician for Northwestern University, and even dabbles from time to time as team physician for U.S. Soccer and USA Rugby. As I recall the stories he's told me, has actually gotten to travel for free to some pretty exotic places in connection with those roles. So Dr. Mjaanes, if you would, please kind of give a general summary about the relationship between AAP and you as it relates to how the board functions.
Well, first I would like to correct you. I'm not sure it was free travel. There was a lot of work going on. So there was a cost to that travel. No, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I really feel fortunate that the AAP chose me to be the representative to NOCSAE, and I actually feel very fortunate that NOCSAE had the foresight to include pediatricians on their board of directors. Historically, pediatricians take care of anyone from premature babies all the way up through college age. We have many of those sports trained pediatricians now that take care of sports injuries and musculoskeletal conditions in athletes of all ages, including up into adulthood. One thing that we have noticed, I think NOCSAE noticed this as well as the AAP, is that rates of participation in sports are increasing, especially for children and teenagers. And unfortunately, injuries are also increasing for pediatric participants in sports. And that's not to say that sports are necessarily becoming more dangerous. I think we are getting better at identifying injuries earlier. And we have more touch points now with athletes, including athletic trainers and other partners in the field that are out at games at younger and younger ages. And so we're better able to identify those injuries. So there's definitely an increase, though, if you look at the raw data in number of participants in sports and in injuries in sports, even in young athletes. Traditionally, perhaps NOCSAE's role has not really delved into areas that affect children. But lately, I believe there has been an increase in those touch points as well. And so a couple come to mind. Number one, commotio cordis. which is an injury that occurs to the heart due to a direct impact from usually a projectile. So it could be a baseball, lacrosse ball, etc. And typically those patients are pediatric, meaning they don't, this condition does not tend to occur in older athletes. It really tends to occur in younger athletes, primarily under the age of 18. And of course, NOCSAE has been instrumental in working to develop chest protectors to protect against commotio cordis. The other issue is, of course, now the increased rates of football participation. And so NOCSAE's work with a youth helmet standard for football is key to protecting our children from future injuries in football. So just a couple areas where I think the AAP is extremely interested in the work that NOCSAE is doing and hopes to have a voice in those conversations, and in areas where NOCSAE is already putting its resources and technology and expertise into developing better standards to help protect those younger patients.
Thank you, Dr. Mjaanes. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the kind words. I know we all have a passion for what we do here, and I think it shows in everybody's approach to all of these problems that we try to address. Dr. Higgs, I know although ACHA has had a long-standing relationship, certainly yours is not quite that long. I'm curious how much you knew about NOCSAE before you were shoved into this position, and perhaps what you've learned since then, or maybe how your perceptions have changed now that you've been on board and involved in the process.
Well, I can say that I was aware of the organization, but beyond that, I didn't really know a whole lot about it. And I think what I have taken away the most from in these last few years is just the collaboration between all levels. So you have the researchers who are doing the very finite research work, and then you have clinicians who are seeing the injuries that are happening. You have equipment companies that are manufacturing the equipment or helping to fit the equipment on the athletes. And so you get that perspective from a lot of different groups and a lot of different angles, and everyone working together so that the product that is certified by NOCSAE actually does what it says it's going to do. It's not just something that's on a shelf that claims to protect a kid against something that it didn't really have the research or the clinical background behind. And so I think that's the piece that I certainly, since being on the board, have really told my patients as well as my friends and my children's friends that that's what that certifying is, that it actually does what it says it's going to do. And there was a need for that protective equipment, and it fills that need.
Have you been, I don't want to say surprised, but have you been pleased with the way the work that we do has progressed during your tenure? As far as it seems like it takes forever sometimes to get from point A to point B, and you know, we always want to go back and make sure that everything's perfect, and sometimes maybe we spend a little more time on the detail perhaps and less on the policy goal. But I'm wondering if you've experienced those frustrations, and if you have, how you dealt with them.
I mean, I think that sometimes it does seem to move slowly, but there's usually a reason why. There's a question or a concern, and yeah, we want to make sure that we have it right, because if something goes wrong with a piece of equipment that was certified, we want to be able to have an answer or prevent that from happening entirely. So I wouldn't say that I've been frustrated by the pace. I think there's usually a specific reason or request as to why something maybe is held up or slowed down.
Dr. Mjaanes, I know as a team physician, you have, I call it hands-on care. I put you in the category of interest on our group as those who work directly with the athletes, more on the at least it seems to be more on the treatment side, perhaps. But of course, our standards are designed to address risks and injuries on the prevention side. Kind of share with me how your role in NOCSAE and your experience with NOCSAE has either shaped or helped inform or otherwise directed your role as a team physician, somebody providing hands-on care?
I think the impact has been significant. So even right now, we're looking at new equipment for next fall football season, and our equipment managers here at Northwestern loop me into these conversations very early. Obviously, part of it is given my role as head team physician, but a part of it is also because they know that I understand the inner workings to a football helmet. I understand the approach to its design and what it's intended to do. And also the limitations and what it can't do, right? It can't protect, for example, against every concussion. But that was never really the design of a football helmet in the first place. So it's been really helpful for me to have that kind of insider's view to NOCSAE and how the process evolves and the work that goes into developing a standard and the work that goes into reassessing standards and making sure that they're still doing what they were designed to do, just as Dr. Higgs mentioned. So no, it's been extremely helpful from that standpoint, especially in the realm of football. And I would also say lacrosse, because we have a large lacrosse program here at Northwestern as well. So in my day-to-day work, the impact has been instrumental. Just in outside work, just with rugby and soccer and other groups that I'm involved with on a national level, the knowledge that I take from NOCSAE helps me with understanding a lot of the data that's out there and the approaches to equipment. So definitely the impact has been great, honestly, in all facets of my career.
There's one aspect of what we do as a board that I think is unique to not just the standards development organization, but actually I think unique in the corporate world. And that is, by design, we have representative directors who represent interests that in more often than not are in direct conflict with each other. So whether you're a manufacturer and you want to make a product and you want to make a profit, you want to keep doing it, your interest may not be the same as another board members. Normally, especially for non-profits, but normally everybody on the board is of the same mind and the same goal, and we're all charging ahead as a unit. And NOCSAE is different in that regard by design. Has that conflict or that back and forth, if you will, in discussions between competing interests been something that you've either experienced or you thought was a little bit unique?
I can go first. I appreciate it, to be honest. I think I always like to take a step back and think about what our mission is. And the mission, to me at least, for NOCSAE is to create a standard for equipment in athletics that saves lives or at least protects lives from catastrophic injury. And our whole goal, everyone's goal in that room around the board of directors table, is that mission, is to help ensure that sports are safe for the participants, as safe as we can make them. And so I think, yes, there are kind of different points of view in the room, which sometimes I wish I had just a bucket of popcorn and could lay back in my chair and just watch the fireworks and the show erupt. But the truth of the matter is, everyone there has the same purpose and the same ultimate goal. I think it's unique in an organization to have differing points of view. Sometimes, as you mentioned, so dichotomically opposed to each other, but working together for the same goal, because I think it helps us see things from different sides. Getting back to your original point, I was a little surprised at first as how long the process does take to move from a concept to an actual idea, to a standard, to actually implementation. But now being exposed to that side and talking with the manufacturers, it totally makes sense to me. They need time to be able to create new product or update their product, and we need time to get that product to the appropriate product, the safest product to the public. And so the ultimate goal is the same for everybody in that room, and I think it helps us deliver a better product.
Dr. Higgs, your response.
I agree. I think it's interesting, and I like to hear the different perspectives, because sometimes if everybody in the same room is thinking the same thing, it's not really an interesting discussion, right? You are all just congratulating each other for agreeing. And so I think that having that different perspective, and Jeff's right, everybody in the end is trying to protect athletes from catastrophic injury. Like, that's the goal, but we have different ways of getting there.
Yeah, one of the phrases in our mission statement is to develop standards where feasible. And I think sometimes feasible initially it means that you can do it, that you can accomplish it. But feasible also means you can do it in a way that doesn't make the protective equipment so expensive that you can't afford to use it. So feasibility is, I look at some of these competing interests as sort of making sure that we don't stray too far from that goal. In some of our one-on-one conversations, I think both of you have mentioned this concept of primary prevention versus secondary prevention. I think I'm phrasing that correctly. Explain a little bit about what that is and how it fits into your role on NOCSAE and how the standards are implemented in your experience. Dr. Mjaanes, we'll start with you.
I like to think of it as primary prevention is trying to prevent something from occurring in the first place, right? So whatever you can do on the front end to prevent an injury from occurring. Where secondary prevention is more, once an injury has occurred, preventing a worse outcome, preventing a worse sequela from that or consequence from that injury. And so a lot of the work that NOCSAE does is really in the primary prevention, which we know is actually the most effective way. Obviously, we'd rather prevent the injuries from happening in the first place. And I think you're safe in this discussion, Mike, because I believe Dr. Higgs and myself are both on salary. And so that probably means that we're not getting paid per injury. We would much rather prevent these injuries from happening in the first place. So we, in general, don't want our athletes to get injured at all. And so I think the take home here is both the work that NOCSAE does in creating a standard, for example, for equipment, whether it's a shin guard or whether it's a safer lacrosse ball or whether it's a football helmet, the idea is to prevent the injury from happening in the first place. But NOCSAE also has a secondary mission, which is providing a lot of resources and funding for research. And the research, the idea there could be both primary prevention, but it also could be secondary prevention. I know some of the work that we funded is looking at incidence rates of concussion or other injuries, for example, but then also how does the management that's out there work to prevent further injury, to help that athlete heal, for example, from their concussion in a timely fashion, to prevent further injury. So the one thing I really appreciate too about NOCSAE is the fact that we have a role both in primary prevention and in secondary prevention.
Dr. Higgs, you want to add to that?
No, I would mostly just reiterate a lot of what he said, but primary prevention is absolutely what the equipment is there to do. And I think sometimes people will think, oh, to be healthy, I have to go to the doctor, but doctors are predominantly secondary prevention. Something is wrong and you go to the doctor to have it fixed. And so primary prevention is things that we talk about, but are not actually participating in oftentimes. And so being on the board to talk about how to do the primary prevention is something we don't always get the chance to do. And so I think that's really exciting. And then, seeing the follow-up of if it doesn't work, and as Jeff said, helmets are designed to help prevent concussions to an extent, but they are certainly not designed to prevent all concussions. But then we're looking at, if there was a concussion with the helmet on, what are the symptoms? How significant are they? Are they much less than had they not been wearing that helmet? And what kind of conditions would they have that? So.
I think concussion is a great subject area to talk about, the primary and secondary, because obviously you want to prevent it, but consequences of not preventing it and then not intervening properly are the sequela, the worsening conditions, perhaps the failure to even recognize the concussion and allow somebody to return to play too soon. So I really appreciate that, and I'll share a little bit of my frustration with the process, just in case it triggers somebody to want to comment. But I remember our technical director made a comment to me one time. We were having a discussion about what can we do to prevent concussions through a helmet standard. Is there something that we can do to truly prevent concussions, blanket prevent concussions? And his response was, if you will tell me ahead of time all the parameters of that collision that would have resulted in a concussion to a player, how fast, how much weight they were carrying, what the mass was, what the directions of the impact were, what his prior health condition was, all those variables that contribute to a concussion. If you would tell me that ahead of time, I'll design a helmet that will prevent that concussion. The problem is that's one of millions of impacts that occur. And so that frustration, plus it's difficult to go to a football game and count every concussion that didn't occur. I've tried, it's really hard to do. So I appreciate that. You mentioned commotio cordis, and that is something that took a long time, even though there were no problems along the way. We were starting from nothing. We really didn't even know what the pathogenics were of the event, didn't know what caused it, didn't know much about it, had to learn that through the research and then eventually get to a standard. In spite of pretty steady progress, no setbacks, it took 10 years to go from nothing to something. And we're still in the process of refining that. So it is a long process. I do want to touch just briefly on the youth helmet standard, and we'll sort of maybe look at kind of wrapping this up a little bit. But how do you see that standard as it's starting to become refined, affecting youth football play? Do you think it's going to have a positive effect? Do you think it may create this false sense of security at that young age, where players go, well, I've got a helmet that's certified now, I don't have to worry about it anymore? Do you see that playing a role at all in that way, Dr. Mjaanes?
I think the youth football helmet standard is a critical step for NOCSAE to take. I think more and more young people are playing football, and while there has been some concern and numbers did fluctuate for a while, I don't think we're ever going to see youth football disappear, at least probably not in my lifetime. And so I think we need to still focus on ways to make it safer. We do know that children are more susceptible to concussion and traumatic brain injury. We know that they have a longer time to recovery. We know that the more concussions that you suffer as a child in your younger days, the more risk you might be at later in life. And also we know about and that kind of plays into the idea of the cumulative effects of repetitive trauma to the head. So I think for all those reasons, it actually is imperative for NOCSAE to continue to work on the youth football helmet standard. Interestingly enough, there have been a couple studies lately, I know you know this, but that have maybe, I don't know if I can say disproven the Gladiator effect, but I would say at least indicate that it might not be playing as significant a role as we thought it would, meaning the idea that I'll put on a helmet and I'll take risks that I otherwise normally wouldn't take. So for all those reasons, I think it's important for us to continue with the youth football helmet. I do think it will eventually make youth football safer. And if the goal is to prevent traumatic head injuries in football, and kids actually wear the helmet, I think we will see a reduced number of those type of injuries. Before I go on though, you did mention a point before that I kind of want to address. I think it would actually fit in here as well, which is just the idea that we talk about primary prevention, but NOCSAE cannot be the only source for primary prevention, meaning the equipment is not the only answer out there to preventing these injuries from happening. You know, we need education, and more people are doing that. That education goes to our players, it goes to parents, it goes to coaches. Education on primary prevention and making football safer and reducing the number of contact practices and changing the age at which athletes engage in contact. Even in other sports like soccer, looking at heading, more studies looking at like when should we initiate heading, how should heading be taught, all those type of things. The education piece and the research piece is critically important. And then legislation, you know, I feel fortunate. This is, you know, it's been what now, over 10 years when, you know, we had the Lystat law and then we had other states follow suit, and now really every state in the country has a law on concussion. And it's a little bit sad, I guess, that you could argue that we had to have a law to ensure that there was a standard of care. But on the other hand, we do have a standard of care now, an approach, and never allowing an athlete who's suspected to have a concussion to go back in the same day of play to get an evaluation. Those things are critical as well. So my point there was just that it can't just be up to NOCSAE. We cannot just rely on the equipment to prevent these injuries. It goes back to your point that you said earlier, Mike. We could probably design a helmet that would prevent every concussion. It might look like a big air bubble that goes around your head and you wouldn't be able to run and play football the way that we know it. But it might work to prevent every concussion, but it has to be feasible, as your point was made earlier. And so it just cannot rely completely on the equipment. There has to be other modes of prevention that are in play as well.
Dr. Higgs, have you been either drug into or thrust into these kinds of conversations between either athlete parents or, and unfortunately, sometimes coaches, with regard to the other things that need to be done besides just making sure you have a helmet that meets a standard and fits and is properly cared for?
I think there's always conversations as a physician, and even in your regular life, not in your job life. Everyone knows that that's what you do, and so oftentimes there's questions or concerns about it. And so I think I get asked the question a lot about football and is it safe for my kid to play football and those types of things. And I think, you know, as I said, there has to be a lot of education and there has to be risk assessment, right? So life comes with risk, and there has to be that, is this worth the risk? And again, NOCSAE and the equipment is designed to take away that catastrophic, because that nothing is worth that risk, right? But can you mitigate the risk enough that it's totally worth it? The teammate experience that the kids get, the benefits of the activity with sport, all of those things, can you mitigate the concerns that parents have? And so that's what helmets are designed to do. And going with the youth helmet, you know, to steal a pediatrician phrase, children are not tiny adults. They're different people, and so you can't just take an adult helmet and put it on a kid and say, oh, it works just as well, because there are other factors. And as we've been learning as we're looking at this, you know, that the head is bigger on a kid than it is on an adult. Their neck isn't as strong on a kid as it is on an adult. They're actually getting their concussions with contact to the ground because that's what they hit the most, not really running into each other. And so looking at all those different things and explaining that not only to the kid, but to the parent, and teaching the kid the proper way to tackle it and do things that's not going to injure the other player along the lines from the beginning to the end is important as well. So those are all reasons from the youth helmet perspective. And then, you know, as we said, the Gladiator Effect, I think a lot of people think that that's true, but especially in kids, if you watch kids on a playground, they're pretty kamikaze anyway. Like it doesn't matter if they're wearing a helmet or not. They're flying off the monkey bars, they're jumping off the swings, they're, you know, kind of testing the limits of what they can do. And so putting something protective on them isn't suddenly going to make them do that more. They kind of do those things anyway. And so this is just providing some protection. I did also want to bring up a point that you brought up earlier with the commotocordis, and that it took 10 years. A big difference between commotocordis and concussion is concussion, unfortunately, is a little bit of a dime a dozen. They happen often, and there's mild concussion, moderate concussion, severe concussion, but you can get lots and lots of people to do a study based off concussion, whereas commotocordis is pretty rare. And so it takes a lot longer to get enough of a power in terms of research to really see what's going on and see the best way to prevent it. So while the end result is, again, catastrophic injury, you have to approach those two different items very differently based on how commonly they occur.
Makes perfect sense. That's in fact, if you look back at our research history, one of the first grants that we funded in the area of commotocordis was to develop the epidemiology, was the creation of that registry by Dr. Marin at Minneapolis Heart Institute. So you're correct. It's you don't get to harvest a lot of those potatoes every year. You have to collect them over a lot of seasons. So I really appreciate that. We're going to wrap up here, but I do want to make one comment. It's perhaps less common now than it was, but frequently the most commonly asked question I get from parents, you used to get a lot of these phone calls and emails, they've seemed to kind of backed off a little bit, but they would call and ask, what's the best helmet for my player to wear, or my kid to wear to prevent concussions? And I'd always answer those questions, the helmets, that's not the first question to ask. The first question to ask and the question is, what can I do to limit the chance that my player or my kid or my whatever is going to get a concussion playing football? Because now we're talking about keeping your head out of the game. Don't hit it when you don't have to. I mean, all these other preventative steps, and the helmet kind of fits like third or fourth down the ladder. Listen, I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your schedules today. I know this is, you have far more pressing things to take care of today than this, but you stopped to do this and we appreciate it. Any other last comments you want to make, or suggestions, or sage advice that I can write down and take with me? I'm happy to listen.
I would just go off of what Dr. Hicks said before, which is we know the benefits of exercise. We know the benefits of sport participation, especially for children, right? We know that not only does it have physical benefits in terms of like your cardiovascular system, your immune function, we know that it has mental emotional benefits, including decreased risks of anxiety and depression. And we know that it has social benefits of teamwork and working together towards a common objective and sharing and all sorts of things like that. So we know that there are significant benefits to playing in sports. And the goal of an organization like the AAP, but also like NOCSAE, is to try to make that participation as safe as possible. And we cannot, I even almost in a way hate the term prevention, because we can't really prevent everything from happening. It's really risk reduction, and we just want to try to reduce the risk as much as possible to make this sport as safe as possible, prevent catastrophic injury and death, and allow kids and athletes to continue to have fun on the field, in the pool, on the mat, wherever they're practicing their sport.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hicks.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. We know all the benefits of sports and athletics, and as he eloquently stated. So, but allowing the kids to do that and to do it safely, and that's where NOCSAE comes in, is to help in that, yes, risk reduction, and looking at ways that we can do that, and whether that is with equipment, whether that's managing the way the sport is played to allow them to learn certain skills at certain ages and then grow as they grow. So example, T-ball is not baseball. If anybody watches it, it's a little frustrating at times, but but the kids are learning the basic concepts of how to do things, and then as they grow, and that is a risk reduction too, because you can't ask them to play on a big baseball diamond when they're 5. They'll just hurt themselves by trying to throw too far or too hard or things like that. And so looking at those pieces, and then that brings in the equipment. Do they need different equipment for that type of sport before they move on to the next level? And heading in soccer is another example of that. So I think looking at all the different factors, but to make sure that kids stay stay involved, stay active, because it's still better to be active and interacting with your peers for your physical health, for your mental health. It's best to be active and doing these things.
Right. Listen, again, thank you so much for taking the time today. Your contributions to the board and to NOCSAE's mission have been invaluable. I'm hoping you're each doing this 5 years from now. I actually hope we're all three doing this 5 years from now, but certainly the two of you. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you.